Hello and welcome to this talk about narrative character design. We're going to take a look at the popular series Game of Thrones and from that derive practical lessons that you can apply to write better characters yourself. Before we dive into the actual lessons, let me quickly give you the basics of Game of Thrones. So it all started as a book series called A Song of Ice and Fire, written by George R. R. Martin, and was later turned into the famous TV show on HBO. The story of Game of Thrones revolves around three different plot lines. First of all, there is the threat in the north. Zombie-like creatures called the White Walkers are marching onto Westeros and kill all human beings in their way. In the east, there is Daenerys Targaryen, who was exiled from Westeros, and she's now leading a rebellion of slaves against slave owners at a place called Slavers Bay with her three dragons and the goal to ultimately return to Westeros and sit on the Iron Throne to become Queen of Westeros. And finally, in Westeros and its capital, King's Landing, there is a constant battle on who's sitting on the Iron Throne, and the noble families try their best to put their houses in a better position politically. Now, if we take a look at how Game of Thrones performed, we see that the book sold more than 90 million copies worldwide, and that's just an insane amount considering that book sales are declining year by year. The average episode of the series had around 18 million viewers, and that's 8 seasons with around 10 episodes each. So we can say that both the TV show and the books were extremely successful, and with the fictional work that is that popular, you can usually tell that the authors got something right. And I would say in the case of Game of Thrones, it's characters. Both the books and the series feature a large cast of very interesting, diverse, three-dimensional characters that develop, sometimes team up, and sometimes battle against each other. But that's just my take on it. Let's hear what the author of the books, George R. R. Martin, has to say about the point of writing fiction.
Character is the heart of all stories. I don't care if you're writing science fiction, fantasy, horror, or mainstream story, literary fiction, mystery novel, historical fiction. It's all about the people who inhabit it. It's all about the characters. And there will be many different kinds of characters. And you should be able to have a certain amount of empathy for them. And that's certainly one thing that I've tried very hard to make part of my fiction.
You have to take your characters and you have to put them through crises. That's what fiction and drama is all about. Is not your hero has a really good time, but things have to happen that cause the characters to question who they are and what their place in the world is and what the meaning of it all is. To go through the dark nights of the soul and times of fear and terror and all of this. I've always taken as my mantra William Faulkner's words in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, where he said, "The human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about."
The human heart in conflict with itself is the only thing worth writing about. That's not only a great quote in and of itself, but it also leads us to the first lesson that we can learn from the series. And that is personify internal conflict. Let's unwrap what is meant with that exactly. If we take a look at the types of conflict that you can have in a fictional work, first of all, there will always be conflict within characters. This would be different parts of their personality grappling with each other and fighting for dominance to see which part of their personality determines their actions. Then the most famous type of conflict is interpersonal conflict, so conflict between two or more individuals. One level above that is conflict between entire groups. So war would be a perfect example of this, where it's not about two individuals having an argument, but sometimes entire nations fighting against each other. And lastly, on the abstract level, there can be conflict between ideas and concepts. So an example for this could be the relationship between the state and religion, and which of these determines the public life, and which of these can influence the other. Now, with these four types of conflict in mind, what the show is really good at is linking the first two types of conflict within people and conflict between people. A lot of times you would have a character who's fighting an inner battle between two different parts of their personality, and then you would have other characters that interact with them and represent these different parts of their personality. They're personifying the internal conflict. Let's make this more clear by looking at a concrete example. And for this, we'll take a look at Sir Jaime Lannister, who's a Sworn Knight of the Kingsguard and also the brother of Queen Cersei. He's the heir of the Lannister family and thus also the heir of their home Casterly Rock. Interestingly, Jaime has two relationships with different women who are both very important to him. First, there's his romantic relationship to his sister, Queen Cersei Lannister, which is something that is strongly looked down upon, even in the world of Westeros. And on the other side, there is his less problematic relationship to a knight called Brienne of Tarth, whom he meets around the second season. So what exactly do these two very different characters represent about Jaime's personality? Cersei Lannister clearly represents his destructive desire. Both of them have an incredible amount of passion for each other, but their relationship constantly causes harm to other people. And you can tell that by the fact that the most horrible things that Jaime does are, for one, pushing a 10-year-old boy out of a window and strangling his own cousin, are done to either maintain his relationship with Cersei or to return to her. Brienne of Tarth personifies something completely different. She's the ideal of knighthood. And when Jaime is around her, he cares much more about honesty, honor, and fighting for people who need protection. You might remember that there is a scene where Brienne has to fight a bear without having a sword, and Jaime comes back to rescue her because he can't let her die after everything that she's done for him. And even after this scene, he's fighting for other people that need protection. For example, Brienne convinces him to look after the Stark girls, Sansa and Arya, and to try to protect them. This personification of internal conflict is also done to other characters in the show, and a prime example of this is Stannis Baratheon. He's the younger brother of King Robert Baratheon, and after his brother died, he wants to take on the Iron Throne in the second season. For Stannis, there are two advisors that are really important to him. On the one side, we have Sir Davos Seaworth, who represents the side of Stannis that is just and merciful, and what is brilliantly done is that it's already shown in the character design of Sir Davos. So you might remember from the series that Sir Davos only has 5 fingers. And that is because he used to be a smuggler and a thief. And when Stannis found out about that, he chopped off 5 of Sir Davos' fingers. But Sir Davos also saved Stannis and his family during the siege of Storm's End. So Stannis took 5 of his fingers, but then made him a knight and his most trusted advisor. So when Sir Davos is around, Stannis cares about mercy and justice and generally acts like a good king. But then on the other hand, there is Lady Melisandre, who's part of a religious cult worshipping the Lord of Light, and she convinces Stannis to convert to this religion. What she represents about Stannis is his cruel ambition to become king and to do everything that has to be done to achieve this goal. This ambition makes Stannis do horrible things, like sacrificing people to the Lord of Light by burning them alive, and it's usually Lady Melisandre who convinces him to do so. What is really interesting with these two parts of his psyche in mind is that later on, when he does the most cruel thing, which is burning his own daughter, right before that event he sends Sir Davos away without a proper explanation why. And you could read that literally as something like he just didn't want Sir Davos to be a witness, but also metaphorically he has to send the merciful and just part of him away before he can fully commit to the most cruel thing he's done. So that is the first lesson: personify internal conflict. Lesson 2: give even your darkest characters some bright moments. So let's quickly have a look at what kind of characters George R.R. Martin wants to write about. In 2018 he said, "I believe in great characters. I don't believe in black and white characters. I don't want to write the band of heroes on one side and the orcs on the other side. But that's not to say that all characters are equally grey. Some are very dark grey, and some are mostly white, but they still have occasional flaws in them." George Martin makes it quite clear here that he's working on a grey spectrum. He doesn't want to write purely evil characters or purely good characters, but authentic characters who have their own motivations and sometimes do evil things and sometimes do good things. With that in mind, it's very important to give the dark grey characters, who tend to be more on the evil side, also moments where they do good things or where they come off as not as bad as you thought. For an example, we will watch a scene between Tyrion and Cersei Lannister. You might know that the two don't have the best relationship. They don't like each other that much, and they're constantly plotting against each other, sometimes even thinking that the other one is trying to kill them right now. And usually in these scenes, Tyrion comes off as the good guy, and we as the audience are on his side, and Cersei comes off as the evil queen. But just take a look at the following scene where Tyrion and Cersei talk about Cersei's children.
"It's just you, me, and Joffrey, the Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm.
I'm sure you'll make a point eventually."
He needs to start acting like a king. This war you started is coming to our doorstep. And if the entire city wants Joffrey dead...
I'm not the one giving the boy whores to abuse.
I thought the girls might help him.
Did you?
I was wrong. If we can't control him...
Do you think I haven't tried? He doesn't listen to me.
It's hard to put a leash on a dog once you've put a crown on its head.
I always hoped he'd be like Jamie. He looks like him. In a certain light.
The boy's more Robert than Jamie.
Robert was a drunken fool, but he didn't enjoy cruelty. Sometimes I wonder
What?
if this is the price for what we've done, for our sins.
Sins? The Targaryens...
Wed brother and sister for hundreds of years, I know. It's what Jamie and I would say to each other in our moments of doubt. It's what I told Ned Stark when he was stupid enough to confront me. Half the Targaryens went mad, didn't they? What's the saying? Every time a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin.
You've beaten the odds. Tommen and Marcella are good, decent children, both of them.
It's a brilliant scene because you can clearly see Cersei going through 3 different emotional stages. The 2 of them start off in some kind of argument. Cersei is pretty irritated and angry, but then she suddenly turns thoughtful and wonders why her son Joffrey turned out the way he did. And lastly, when Tyrion compliments her on her 2 other children, Tommen and Myrcella, she becomes very emotional and immediately tears up when he mentions it. So what this scene is trying to depict is that despite all of the evil things that Cersei has done in the past, she's a person who really cares about being a good mother and raising decent children. And that gives this character, who's clearly on the more darker side of the grey spectrum, a bright side that we as the viewers can identify with and even admire about her. Another example is Ramsay Bolton, who is known as Ramsay Snow for the most part of the series, and he's the bastard son of Roose Bolton, so not his legitimized heir. Even though we saw the quote of George Martin saying that he doesn't want to write black and white characters, this one is probably the closest you'll find to pure black. He's a murderer, torturer and rapist, and generally somebody that you don't want to meet in person. But here again, the writers are giving Ramsay his bright moments. Just take a look at the following scene where his father rewards him for his actions during the war and makes him his legitimized heir and son.
Now tell me, what is your name?
Ramsay Snow.
No, not Ramsay Snow. Open it. From this day until your last day, you are Ramsay Bolton, son of Roose Bolton, Warden of the North.
You honor me. I swear I will uphold your name and your tradition. I will be worthy of you, Father. I promise.
When Ramsay learns about the content of this letter, you can see that he's honestly and positively surprised. He gasps and immediately falls onto his knees and says he wants to be worthy of this honor. So again, despite the evil things he's done before, in this scene he's clearly not an evil guy. Instead, he's just somebody who wants to be recognized by his father. And it makes the character both more believable and more interesting at the same time. Let's move on to the third lesson. Define a guiding principle that drives your characters. I'm sure you all had this moment before where you were consuming a work of fiction, maybe a book, a game or a series, and a character was acting in a way that you just didn't understand. It didn't match their personality. And that was probably because the authors either didn't establish the guiding principle of this character or they didn't follow it through to the very end. So what exactly is this guiding principle? Let's take a look at something I call the hierarchy of character. If we look at characters, at the lowest level we will find their concrete actions, what they do, whom they talk to, how they interact with them, what they say in their interactions. Then, a level above that, there are their plans. And you can think of plans as basically sequences of actions to achieve something. The thing they want to achieve is obviously their goal. An example of a goal that many characters in the series have is sitting on the Iron Throne, so becoming queen or king of Westeros. And these goals are usually derived from the things that the characters value. So if you want to sit on the Iron Throne, it is very likely that power, authority, or status are things that you value highly. And then at the top of this pyramid, there is something that I would call the guiding principle, which you can think of as their most sacred value of a character combined with their most ambitious goal. So basically the reason for their existence and the meaning in their life, what they want to achieve and be remembered for. And something the show is particularly good at is having the characters express their guiding principles in very concise and elegant ways. So let's just have a quick look at some of the characters expressing what their whole life is about. And we'll start with Tywin Lannister. So he says, "It's the family name that lives on. It's all that lives on. Not your personal glory, not your honor, but family. The future of our family will be determined in the next few months. We could establish a dynasty that will last 1,000 years, or we could collapse into nothing as the Targaryens did." So to shorten that a bit, we can see that it is important for him to sustain the legacy of his family, of the Lannister family, and to make sure that his family is well off even after his death. Then another character, Varys, who is the master of spies in King's Landing, he says, "You wish to know where my loyalties lie? Not with any king or queen, but with the people. The people who suffer under despots and prosper under just rule. We don't know their names, but they're just as real as you and I. They deserve to live, they deserve food for their children. I will act in their interest no matter the personal cost." That's quite a strong statement, basically saying that it's Varys' mission to bring about prosperity for the common man and woman, obviously. And lastly, let's have a look at Daenerys Targaryen that we already talked about in the intro. She says, "Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell, they're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground. I'm not going to stop the wheel, I'm going to break the wheel." So she's using the metaphor of the wheel to express that her goal is to break the vicious circle of powerful people oppressing the poor people. And you can see that guiding principle everywhere in her character art, because as we already said in the intro, her plot is basically about leading a revolution of slaves against slave owners, so of dispossessed people against powerful people. If you establish guiding principles like these for your characters, then follow them through in their arcs, and also have them express their guiding principles to the audience, the actions of your characters will always seem consistent and somehow true to their personality. And you can even have your characters do horrible things, like Tywin Lannister, but we will still understand where they're coming from and why they did that. That's the proper use of the guiding principle. Lesson 4. Chart your character's journey along a sequence of nuanced adjectives. We're now entering the realm of character development. And if you learn about character development, for example from film, what you'll often see is something like this. So you have a graph with two axes, and on one of them there's good and evil, and this is mapped out over time for specific characters. Then you could draw a graph like this, so a character that starts out flawed, but tries to become better. Then some of their evil traits return, for example because of their criminal past haunting them, that's quite popular in movies, but in the end they manage to conquer this evil part of them and become a much better person. And this would be labeled a positive character arc because your character is starting out flawed and becoming better over the course of time. Of course, you can also do the opposite. You can have a character that starts out mostly good, but then something happens to them and they have to act in an evil way. They try to recover from that, but then the death spiral takes on and they become more and more like a supervillain over time. A good example for this is Anakin Skywalker in the Star Wars series, who starts out mostly as an innocent child, but then over time, as bad things happen to him, he turns from an innocent kid into Darth Vader. If this is how we think about character development, we can immediately see that there are problems arising from this method. Firstly, if you can have a negative character arc, a positive character arc, or a flat arc, which basically means your character doesn't change at all, it's inevitable that the development of your characters will all feel very similar if you only have these three options. And for me, the more important problem is that a graph like this doesn't help you as a writer. How do you write a character who's currently at 30% good or 60% evil? Good and evil are just way too subjective and general to plan out the stages of your character's development. So instead, what we can observe in Game of Thrones is that there's not too much development between good and evil happening, but instead we have characters who develop along a series of more nuanced adjectives that are also more helpful for you as a writer if you want to determine how your character should act. Let's take the character development of Sansa Stark as an example here. She is the eldest daughter of Eddard and Catelyn Stark, and at the very beginning of the series she is betrothed to Prince Joffrey. And that starts her whole journey because she and parts of her family travel to King's Landing so she can learn how to act at court and can already prepare the upcoming wedding. So if we were to describe her journey in terms of adjectives, she starts out very naive. In the first season, Sansa is living in some kind of fantasy world with princes in shining armors and fair maidens. And she thinks that just because Joffrey is supposed to be king later, and because he's handsome, that he's a nice person, and that the best thing that could happen to her is being married to him. So this quickly changes when she learns about the true nature of Joffrey. When her father is executed and he forces her to look at his dead body, she turns disillusioned. The fantasy world that she's been living in for her whole life is falling apart, and she doesn't know how to react. And you can clearly see that in the show, and there's a short moment where she tries to murder Joffrey basically, but she's stopped. So in the aftermath of her father's execution, she's shocked and she doesn't know how to act. Then she goes into some kind of pretending mode. So she's going on about Joffrey being her prince and that she's loyal to him and will never betray him. She's almost repeating that like a mantra to everybody who is talking to her. But the difference of this pretending mode to acting is that she's not convincing at all. Everybody knows that she hates Joffrey and everybody knows she's just saying these things to survive. And then again, things change for her. So you might remember that Joffrey is poisoned at his own wedding, and Sansa is one of the suspects, so she has to leave the capital with Littlefinger, who brings her to the Eyrie, where her aunt Lysa Arryn lives. And at this point, she has become quite a good actor. Littlefinger is put on a trial because he killed Lysa Arryn, and Sansa is the only witness. So the people of the Vale try to interrogate Littlefinger and also Sansa. And Sansa, despite knowing that Littlefinger killed her aunt, lies about it and convinces the families of the Vale that it was suicide. So she manages to save Littlefinger by deceiving other people. Still, at this point, she has a major flaw, which is that she still trusts Littlefinger. She saves him because, she thinks that she'll be better off with him and that she can trust him in some way, which leads to more troubles for her. Littlefinger weds her to Ramsay Bolton, that we already talked about. So she's going through hell a second time, this time with another psychopath, who is arguably even worse than Prince Joffrey. This leads to Sansa turning suspicious of everything and everyone. Basically, she's no longer able to trust, but at least she's seeing through a lot of lies and manipulations by other people. And you can tell that she's completely lost her trust by the way she interacts with her other family members when they are reunited. So Jon Snow and Arya Stark. She doesn't really know what they're up to, and she even begins to think that Arya might be interested in killing her. Anyways, that's not how her journey ends. In the final season, she's capable of manipulation and getting other people to do what she wants without them being aware of it. But compared to the last step, she's made a step forward because she's at least able to trust some people now, which is her family, so Bran, Arya, and Jon, and she tries to act in their best interest, even though we know that in the last season it doesn't work out that well. If we look at that character development as a whole, you can see there's not a lot of good and evil going on here. At least it's not obvious that being naive is a good thing, or that being suspicious, or at least capable of manipulation, is an entirely bad thing in the world of Game of Thrones. Instead, what we can observe here is a development from passive to active. If you were to give Sansa's character arc a theme, it would be turning from the plaything of psychopaths, manipulators, and cruel people to an active and very talented player of the political game. And that's just way more nuanced character development than positive, negative, and flat character arcs. Related to character development is what happens to your characters and in what way that enables and even enforces the development they're going through. So lesson number 5 is take away what your characters value most and see how they deal with it. Both the books and the show are very good at putting characters through their personal hell, basically, making them suffer in ways that are tailored to their personality. And to give you an example of this, we can take a look at the story of Brandon Stark, who is the second son of Eddard and Catelyn Stark, and later becomes the Three-Eyed Raven, some sort of magical creature that is able to look into the past and future of Westeros. Bran is involved in the first major plot twist of the first episode of the very first season. And let's just quickly have a look at that very special moment in the show.
Quite the little climb, aren't you? How old are you, boy?
10.
10. things I do for love.
As you may remember, Bran sees something that he's not supposed to see, and Jaime Lannister shoves him out of the window of a tower. So he falls down, and we later learn that he managed to survive the fall, but still when he wakes up, he's no longer able to use his legs, so he's basically lying in bed and later has to be moved around in some kind of wheelchair. Now that event makes you wonder a bit, why is it that that specific thing happens to Bran? And to figure that out, we only have to look at what we learn about Bran in the very first episode. The first thing is that he wants to be a knight, so we can observe him practicing archery, practicing with a bow and arrows. And in the books it's made even clearer that he admires the great knights from Westeros past and wants to become one of them later. The other thing that we learn is that he loves to climb around the castle. Despite his mother telling him not to do that because she worries about him, it has become his hobby, so to say. He's become quite good at climbing and never falls down. If you take these two together, his dream of becoming a knight, so his future profession in a way, and his hobby to climb, what is important for both of them is that he's autonomous, that he's able to move around freely, and that he doesn't depend on other people. So being forced to be moved around by other people because he can no longer use his legs is literally the worst thing that could happen to this character. It puts an end to both his dream of becoming a knight and his hobby of climbing immediately. And we can tell that he's very affected by that because in the show he says that he'd rather be dead than not being able to use his legs. Still, losing his freedom of movement is also what kicks off his character development to become the Three-Eyed Raven, because he's now freed up to pursue other things than fighting and climbing, and this magical creature, the Three-Eyed Raven, mostly lives in visions of the past and future, so for that it's perfectly fine that he's not able to move around. Ironically, the same thing that happens to Bran is also what happens to the character who pushed him out of the window, Jaime Lannister. What we learn about him is that he absolutely loves sword fighting. He's a very skilled swordsman, and he says about himself that it's the only thing that he was ever good at. So naturally what the authors do is make him lose his hand while he's in captivity. And this brings him down quite a bit. Before that event, he used to be very arrogant, but now he's turning more and more humble over time, even though it takes a lot of time. He's no longer able to solve all of his conflicts by fighting, so he has to focus on talking and negotiating instead. And he also tries to relearn fighting and obviously needs a mentor for this, which makes him depend on another person that is more skilled than him. Lastly, there's also Brandon's father, Eddard Stark, and in all of the scenes in the first season, it is made clear that he values honor and honesty above maybe everything else except his family. So the worst thing that could happen to him, and of course that does happen to him in the series, is that he is made to confess in front of the public to crimes that he didn't commit. So he taints his honor and honesty in an attempt to save his life and his family. It would have been very interesting to see how this character deals with it, but unfortunately we never get to see that because just one scene after this confession he's being executed. With these three examples, Bran, Jaime, and Eddard Stark, you can clearly see how the authors found the things that are most important to them and then managed to take that away to kickstart their character development in a completely different and unexpected direction. Lesson 6 deals with the question, how can you make sure that the events that the people in your fictional world encounter match the personality and the storylines of the characters that encounter them? You don't want to just roll the dice and determine randomly what each character is confronted with. Ideally, it should come from within them. And one method to achieve that is to derive your characters' victories from their virtues and failures from their flaws. And I'm using victories and failures in a very general sense here. So victories would just be the good things that happen to them, and failures obviously the bad things. In my opinion, the best character to highlight this method is Robb Stark, who's the eldest son of Eddard and Catelyn Stark, and is later declared king in the north when his father is imprisoned by the Lannisters. If we take a look at his victories, the good things that happen to him, there are not that many in his character arc, but without a doubt the best thing that happens to him is that he meets his future wife Talisa, falls in love with her, and later marries her. Now one of his virtues is that Robb is very compassionate for his enemies, so just because people ended up on the other side of the battlefield, he doesn't hold a personal grudge against them or wants to do cruel things to them. Of course, that begs the question how these two things are connected, the virtue to his victory in this sense. And the answer to that is that his virtue is the thing that enables his relationship to Talisa. So Talisa, as you may know, is a healer or a nurse, and we get to see her for the very first time on the battlefield after a battle that Robb won. and she's taking care of all the wounded soldiers who are mostly Lannister soldiers. While she's taking care of a heavily wounded soldier, Robb appears and tries to help her with the medical operation. And at the very start, it's obvious that she doesn't like him at all. She thinks that he's the reason for all of this violence and the bloodshed, and it's kind of true because he was the one starting this war. But she also notices his empathy and compassion for his enemies, and that basically gives him a second chance. And then when they meet again, they really fall in love and later get married. So Robb's virtue, compassion for his enemies, really enables his greatest victory, meeting Talisa and their relationship. Talking about the failures, about the bad things that happened to Robb, there are a couple more. First of all, while Robb is marching onto the south, Theon Greyjoy, whom Robb considered his best friends, invades Winterfell. Then Robb loses half of his army because he executed Rickard Karstark, the head of House Karstark, and thus lost the support of this house. And lastly, the most horrible thing that happens to him is that he, his men, and parts of his family are slaughtered at a famous event called the Red Wedding. All of these three failures are connected to his fatal flaw, which is ignorance of his allies' motivations. So he trusts the people that fight for him despite not really knowing what they're up to and what is important to them. This makes a very nice contrast. There's ignorance for his allies on one side and compassion for his enemies on the other side. And it's also a flaw that he shares with his father Eddard Stark, who also trusts people that he has no reason to trust, which gets both of these characters killed in the end. Now, if we take a look at how this flaw caused all of the failures, first of all, Robb sends Theon to his father Balon Greyjoy because he wants Theon to negotiate on his behalf. Robb just assumes that Theon is loyal to him and because of that thinks it's a good idea to send him to his father despite his mother warning against that. And Robb is completely unaware of the inner battle that Theon is fighting, who is not exactly sure whether he is a Stark or a Greyjoy. He was raised by the Starks, but he was born a Greyjoy, and he doesn't know how to resolve this conflict. So of course when Robb sends him away, Balon Greyjoy somehow manages to convince Theon that he's a Greyjoy indeed and that the Starks are his enemies, and because of that Theon invades Winterfell. Regarding the second failure, Rickard Karstark lost one of his sons to Jaime Lannister while Jaime was a prisoner of war. So he's seeking revenge and wants to kill Jaime or other Lannister prisoners. And Robb doesn't really understand him, he doesn't allow him to take revenge and just assumes that Rickard will follow his orders. Of course, that's not what happens. Rickard takes his revenge by killing two innocent Lannister prisoners, and when Robb finds out about that, he executes Rickard Karstark, and because of that, loses the support of House Karstark forever. Lastly, the Red Wedding is initiated by two people, Roose Bolton on the one hand and Walder Frey on the other hand, and both of them conspire against Robb because in their opinion he betrayed them. Roose Bolton is an experienced soldier, and Robb constantly rejects his advice and sends him away quite often, usually so that he can spend time with his wife Talisa. Apparently he's unaware that Roose Bolton values status and authority very highly, and thus takes it as an insult to be ignored and sent away. And regarding Walder Frey, Robb was supposed to marry one of his daughters, but in the end breaks his vow and instead just marries Talisa. And that is taken as an offense by Walder Frey, who is a character that doesn't like to pick sides, but if he picks sides, he wants his family to be somehow better connected afterwards. So denying him this marriage causes Walder Frey to team up with Tywin Lannister to plot against Robb Stark. As you can see with both the failures and the victories, they directly stem from personal strength or weaknesses of Robb's character, and thus the events that happen to Robb Stark, even though most of them are terrible, feel true to the character and in some way consistent. The seventh lesson is about presenting characters in different power dynamics to characterize them fully. These different power dynamics exist because human beings tend to organize themselves in hierarchies. Sometimes that's hierarchies of authority or of experience. So as an example, when you're a third-year student, there are the professors who have much more experience than you, then there are the people in your year who have a similar amount of experience, and then there could be the first-year students who have way less experience and might be looking for guidance. And these are three different power dynamics that you operate in. But to make it even clearer, let's take a very specific situation from the series, and that is when Jon Snow joins the Night's Watch. When he arrives at Castle Black, there are a couple of people that travel with him that join the Night's Watch, so they are roughly equals, at least in terms of their experience with the Night's Watch. Then there are the people who have been at the Night's Watch for much longer. There's Lord Commander Mormont and also Sir Alisa, who trains the new recruits in sword fighting. So those two characters would be superior to John. And then there are characters who are inferior to John. For example, Samuel Tali, who joins a bit later, who has no experience at all in sword fighting or in anything that the Night's Watch is doing. So he's constantly looking for guidance and help from John. And then there's also his direwolf Ghost, who is John's pet basically. And he's clearly inferior because he's only alive because John decided to look after him and care for him. Taken together, we end up with three different kinds of power dynamics. So we have John's relationship to his equals, his relationship to his superiors, and his relationship to his inferiors. And if a character acts very differently in one power dynamic compared to the other ones, that usually reveals something about them that you otherwise wouldn't be able to see. If we talk about how John acts in these power dynamics, at the very start he gets into a lot of trouble with his equals, precisely because he doesn't treat them as equals. He thinks he's superior because he's a better fighter and is extremely arrogant, and it almost leads to him being stabbed by his future brothers. But he later somehow manages to drop this arrogance after a discussion with Tyrion, and his equals turn into real friends over time. This power dynamic starts out problematic, and the same is true for his relationship to superiors. He gets into a lot of conflict with Sir Alisa, who definitely doesn't really like John, and John has a problem with taking orders from other people, and he doesn't want to be a serf. So that gets him into problems with both Sir Alisa and Lord Commander Mormont, who actually likes John and wants to make him the next Lord Commander, but for that John first has to learn how to obey orders, and usually he doesn't do that. So even though John struggles with these two power dynamics, the equals and the superiors, from the very start he treats his inferiors quite well. John decides to help Sam with the sword training so that he can stand a chance to survive, and he even defends him against some other brothers of the Night's Watch who are threatening or insulting Sam. So this was a short recap how John acts in different power dynamics. More generally, you might wonder which of these three relationships you should pay special attention to. And there's a quote from another fantasy series I really like, from Sirius Black in the Harry Potter series, who says, "If you want to know what a man's like, take a good look at how he treats his inferiors, not his equals." He's saying that the relationship from you to people that depend on you, that look up to you, is of special importance and reveals something about the true nature of one's personality. And this statement certainly applies to many characters in the series. And we'll take a look at Peter Baelish as an example, who is better known as Littlefinger. He's the Master of Coin in King's Landing, and later leaves to become the Lord Protector of the Vale. We already mentioned him when we discussed the character arc of Sansa Stark, and in the following scene he's put on trial for the murder of Lisa Arryn by the noble people of the Vale, and he's clearly inferior, so his life depends on the decision of the noble families of the Vale that now interrogate him, and just watch how he acts.
You have foreign blood, don't you, Baelish?
A great-grandfather from Bravos, yes. I suppose all of our ancestors came from somewhere else, originally.
Our forebears settled the Vale thousands of years ago. We've fought off invaders ever since.
The beauty of the Vale is matched only by the nobility of its great families. Lady Arryn often told me that you were her rock, Lord Royce.
Well, she told me nothing about you, Baelish.
As you can see, he's quite friendly and soft-spoken, and immediately uses the opportunity to compliment the noble families of the Vale, and then directly addresses Lord Royce, one of his interrogators, saying that Lady Arryn thought of him as her rock, which is probably a statement that he just invents in the situation so that he can improve his relationship with the interrogators. So that's how Littlefinger acts when he's inferior. Now let's compare that to a situation where he's superior. In the following scene you can see him talking to one of his employees who's crying and not able to work after a recent event that happened at the workplace.
Did he hurt you?
No, my lord. It's Megan.
Who?
She works for you. She's the one. The gold clerks. They killed her baby.
Ah, yes. That was poorly handled. Sometimes those with the most power have the least grace.
I can't stop thinking about it. I can't sleep. Her poor little baby.
You know, you remind me of another girl. A lovely thing I once acquired from a leasing pleasure house. Beautiful. Like yourself. And intelligent. Like yourself. But she wasn't happy. She cried. Often. I asked her why, but we didn't have the kind of rapport that you and I have. Yes, it was quite sad. Girls from the Lycean pleasure houses are expensive. Extremely expensive. And this one wasn't making me any money. I hate bad investments. Really, I do. They haunt me. I had no idea how to make her happy. No idea how to mitigate my losses. A very wealthy patron, he offered me a tremendous amount of money to let him transform this lovely, sad girl, to use her in ways that would never occur to most men. And you know what occurs to most men. I would not say he succeeded in making her happy, but my losses were definitely mitigated.
That's clearly a completely different Littlefinger. So he starts out friendly and tries to comfort her, but then very quickly the tone shifts and he's telling her the story of another of his employees to basically say to her, if you're not happy at work, I'll let evil people do evil things to you. Another nice little touch that the writers added here is that his employee mentions Megan, another girl that works for Littlefinger, and he just says, who? So he doesn't know the name of his employees, and when it's revealed that her baby boy was killed at Littlefinger's brothel, he just says that it was poorly handled. That's certainly not a good way of reacting when one of your employees' baby is killed. So when he's inferior, Littlefinger acts in a calm and friendly way. He tries to compliment people and appear as if he's harmless, but when he's superior, he's threatening people, he's ignorant of the people who work for him, and doesn't care too much about the things that happen to them. Let's compare that to another character that we already talked about, Tywin Lannister. You may remember that there is a point of time in the series where he is at Harrenhal, and Arya Stark is also there, dressed up as a boy. And Tywin Lannister doesn't know that she's Arya Stark, but he certainly notices that she's not a boy but a girl. And he talks to her for a bit and finds her quite interesting, and then decides to make her his cupbearer, so basically his servant while he's having dinner or lunch. Arya, on the other hand, obviously knows that it's Tywin Lannister, because he's quite famous in the world of Westeros, but she can't reveal her true identity because Tywin is an enemy of her family. This is clearly the power dynamic between somebody who's superior, Tywin, and somebody who's inferior, Arya, and just have a look at the following scene where they interact at dinner.
Harrenhal was built to withstand an attack from the land. 1 million men could have marched on these walls, and 1 million men would have been repelled. But an attack from the air with dragon fire, Harren and all his sons roasted alive within these walls. Aegon Targaryen changed the rules. That's why every child alive still knows his name, 300 years after his death.
Aegon and his sisters.
Hmm?
It wasn't just Aegon riding his dragon. It was Rhaenys and Visenya too.
Correct. Student of history, are you?
Rhaenys rode Meraxus. Visenya rode Vhagar.
I'm sure I knew that when I was a boy.
Visenya Targaryen was a great warrior. She had a Valyrian steel sword she called Dark Sister.
She's a heroine of yours, I take it. Are most girls more interested in the pretty maidens from the songs? Jonquil, flowers in her hair?
Most girls are idiots.
You remind me of my daughter.
It starts with Tywin giving Arya a history lesson about the place that they're currently at, and he also learns a thing or two from Arya about the Targaryens that attacked this place. Overall, the two of them just have a very pleasant exchange. They're not threatening each other or fighting for dominance. They're just having an interesting conversation. And this exchange definitely looks more like an exchange between equals than a power dynamic between superior and inferior. And Tywin acts very differently than Littlefinger. An interesting side note is that later Arya gets the chance to kill Tywin, and that would make things for her family much easier, but ultimately she refuses to do it. And I would say that at least one of the reasons for that is that she saw how he interacted with her, with an inferior, and from that came to the conclusion that despite Tywin having very different motivations for the things he does, he's not a truly evil person that deserves to die. Lesson 8. Use backstory to describe, not just to explain. Let's take some time to talk about plot and backstory and the difference between them. So when you're writing a story, you're also creating a world in which the story takes place. This could be a version of the real world or a made-up fantasy world, but still you're creating some kind of universe, and that universe has a timeline. This timeline obviously includes the starting point of your story, and there will be a point in time when the story ends. And all of the events that happen between this starting point and the end of the story is called the plot. But then you also have the imagined past of both your universe and all of the characters that live in it, and the events from there leading up to the starting point of your story. And all of that would be labeled backstory. So taken together, you basically have two different timelines, backstory and plot, so past and present, that you can use to characterize the people that live in your universe. And there is a very specific thing that is usually done with backstory, mostly in movies in my opinion. So what they would do is they would define a character and how they are at the starting point of the story. They are a similar character when the story ends, but there is a huge offset between the imagined past and the starting point. So you would have this character acting in some way, and then you would see flashbacks to their past, maybe when they were still a kid, and they would act in a completely different way. And then of course when there's such a contrast between the imagined past and the starting point, backstory is used to answer the why. Why did the character become the way they are right now? What happened to them? And how did that transition occur? What that does is creating a sense of mystery in the audience, and we wonder what happened to this character that led to such a drastic change. However, there are a couple of problems with this method, with the first one being that you can only do this to characters that you spend a lot of time with. For side characters, it's simply not possible to showcase and explain a massive character development between their past and the starting point of the story. And the other problem with this method is that usually before we care about the why, we want to have the what answered. So before we look for reasons for why a certain state was caused, we first want to know what that state is like. You're not interested in why it rains, for example, before you know what rain is. And applied to characters, that means before we get some explanation of why they are the way they are, we first want to know what are they even like. So they first have to be characterized in their present state. And backstory can serve an important function here. With backstory, you have the advantage that it's about events that happened in the past. So you can give a condensed version of a lot of different events that might take a lot of time to show an actual plot, but in backstory, they're just talked about in one or two lines of characters reminiscing about this past event. So backstory can be used to confront the audience with a condensed version of what the character used to be like and still is like today. And that is a very efficient way of characterization. In Game of Thrones, there are many scenes where backstory is used to describe what a character is like right now, and we'll take a look at a few examples. Starting with Roose Bolton, who is the Lord of the Dreadfort and later becomes the Warden of the North after betraying Robb Stark at the Red Wedding. So here's a scene about his past. Brynden Tully asks him, "Didn't you marry one of these Frey girls?" And he says, "Aye. Lord Walder let me choose any of his granddaughters and promised me the girl's weight in silver as a dowry, so I have a fat young bride." Catelyn Stark says, "I hope she makes you very happy." And he finishes, "Well, she's made me very rich." This event, him wedding one of the Frey girls, is something that either happened before the series takes place or something that happens off screen, so I would count it as backstory, and it immediately tells us a lot about this character. He seems to be very pragmatical and clever because he was offered his bride's weight in silver, so he chose his bride not based on looks or whether she makes for interesting conversation, but he just chose a fat young bride. The other thing that is quite obvious is that Catelyn says, "Oh, she makes you very happy," and he just replies, "Well, she's made me very rich." So he doesn't seem to be very interested in emotions, love, or pleasure, but more interested in status and money that he can use to improve his status. Another good example of using backstory to describe a character comes from Stannis Baratheon, and in the following scene he's talking to his advisor Sadavos Seaworth about the siege of Storm's End. "We were forgotten. Robert and Ned Stark, they were the heroes, the glorious rebels marching from battle to battle, liberating towns from the yoke of the Mad King, while I held Storm's End with 500 men. No one has forgotten, your grace." "No? Robert did. He gave Storm's End to Renly after the war. Renly never fought a day in his life." "He was only a boy." "Then why'd he give him Storm's End?" "First, we ate the horses. We weren't riding anywhere, not with the castle surrounded. We couldn't feed them, so fine, the horses. Then the cats. Never liked cats, so fine. I do like dogs. Good animals, loyal, but we ate them. Then the rats. The night before you slipped through I thought my wife was dying. Robert told me to hold Storm's End, so I held it." So again, there's a lot of information about what Stannis was like and still is like. Especially this last sentence, "Robert told me to hold Storm's End, so I held it." This alludes to a trait of Stannis, which is that he's very concerned with doing his duty. His older brother told him to do something, and because he thinks that's how things are supposed to work in Westeros, he just did it. Also, the way he describes the siege and how they ate the horses, then the cats, then the dogs, and that they always starved during the siege, he does it in a very neutral way. He's not complaining. He just did his duty and endured everything that was entailed without getting too emotional about it. But an interesting thing that we see here is that something is clearly nagging at him, because he doesn't understand why he didn't receive Storm's End, and instead it went over to his younger brother Renly. And we already talked about that justice and fairness are quite important to Stannis. So him not receiving Storm's End, even though he's the older brother of Renly, and even though he defended it, is unfair in his opinion. That's why he kind of complains about it. The reason he's so angry that Renly got Storm's End is not necessarily because Stannis is the older brother and he should get it, but he says Renly never fought a day in his life. So he's judging people not necessarily by their family, but more by their actions. And Renly is not a warrior, so he shouldn't have a castle. And that's a very interesting trait of Stannis, treating people by how they act, not how they were born, that we can always see in his interaction with Sadavos. Sadavos comes from a poor family. He was not a knight before he met Stannis, but Stannis judges him by the way he acted, and because he saved him at the siege of Storm's End, Sadavos turned into his friend and most trusted advisor. Not because it was his birthright, but because of the way he acted. For the final example, let's go back to Littlefinger that we already discussed a lot in the last lesson. And he has a shared history with Ned Stark's older brother, who is already dead when the series starts. So in this scene, one of his employees says, "I do believe my lord's in love," and he replies, "For many years, most of my life really, and she loved me too. She told me about all the horses that she liked, the castle that she wanted to live in, and the man that she wanted to marry. A northerner with a jaw like an anvil. So I challenged him to a duel. I mean, why not? I'd read all the stories. The little hero always beats the big villain in all the stories. In the end, she wouldn't even let him kill me. Do you know what I learned losing that duel? I learned that I'll never win. Not that way. That's their game, their rules." So here he's talking about how he used to be in love with Catelyn Stark and fought a duel so that he could marry her, but in the end he lost that duel against Ned's older brother. And this is a perfect way of combining describing the character with explaining why they are the way they are right now. For description, what we learn about him is he fell in love with Catelyn and he wanted to marry her, and that highlights his ambition. He wants to have something, so he takes it, even though he doesn't come from one of the great houses, and Catelyn does. So a marriage between them would not be usual in Westeros. He still decides that he wants to marry her. And then there's a northerner who gets in his way, and he challenges him to a duel. And the duel at the time ended with one of the competitors being dead. So this northerner got into the way of Littlefinger's ambitions, and he was fine with killing him for that. It tells you a lot about the present Littlefinger. And then he says, "Do you know what I learned losing that duel? I learned that I'll never win, not that way. That's their game, their rules." So that explains why when the story starts, the Littlefinger that we see is no longer challenging people to duels. Instead, he's plotting against them, acting as a friend, and then betraying them. And that seems to be a direct consequence of his backstory, where he challenged someone to a duel, but he's not known for his physical strength and lost that, so he had to find another way to achieve his ambitions. Like I said before, Littlefinger is the perfect example of using backstory for both purposes, describing the current state of a character and also how and why they got there. Lesson 9. Repeatedly pair the same characters, especially after profound transformations. So character pairing deals with the question that if you have a diverse cast of many characters, how do you pair them? So which character meets which other character? How much time do they spend together? What do they do together? Are they separated in some way? Do they join another group together? This is all part of character pairing. And of course, you could approach character pairing from different angles. One approach would be to say, well, I have a lot of different characters, so the best way to pair them is to have each character interact with as many different other characters as possible, to get the maximum amount of different relationships that you could use. And certainly that's done to some degree in the show. There are characters that meet a lot of other characters, like Jon Snow, for example. But another thing the series does instead is repeating the same constellations. So characters that interact with each other over and over again and are often reunited after one of them has changed in a way. To give you an example of this, we'll talk about Arya Stark and the Hound. If we examine their relationship, it doesn't start off that well. The first time they're really brought together, it's because the Hound takes Arya hostage. He basically wants to bring her to her family to earn some money. And Arya hates the Hound. She wants to kill him. He's on her list of people that she wants to kill eventually because he followed order and in the first season killed one of Arya's friends. That's certainly not the best way to start a relationship between two characters. You can tell that the Hound is clearly superior. He has all the physical power and the experience. At that point in time, Arya is not a skilled fighter yet, so the Hound is dominant in all their interactions, and you can see that he's taking her with him on his horse so that she cannot get away. Despite that rough situation, the two of them develop quite an interesting relationship where Arya learns a lot from the Hound, both about life in general, but also about fighting, and he turns into some kind of mentor. But still, the two of them end up being separated. It looks like the Hound is about to die and Arya leaves him. She then sails to Bravos to become a faceless man, an assassin basically. And we learn that the Hound managed to survive and he wakes up in a camp led by a religious priest and then develops in a very different direction. He starts to fight for people other than himself and later teams up with the Brotherhood to journey to the north and fight the White Walkers. Both of them, when they're separated, they go on very different journeys and develop into different directions. Then, later in the final season, they meet again in Winterfell to face off the army of the dead that is approaching Westeros. Here, the Hound is no longer superior in their relationship. Arya is now a skilled fighter, maybe even more skilled than the Hound, and emotionally the Hound is kind of worn down after all the fights he's had, and he almost seems a bit depressive, so Arya is able to dominate their interactions in a way. Then the army of the dead approaches. Both of them want to fight them. The Hound thinks that the battle is lost and already wants to give up, but he remembers that it's important for him to protect Arya, and he manages to save her life during the battle. Following the battle, the two of them, they travel to King's Landing, both with their own missions, but still they travel together. The Hound wants to kill his brother, and Arya wants to kill the Queen Cersei. And here they're really riding off as equals, and this makes a very nice comparison with both of them on their own horse to the first picture, where Arya is still on Sandor Clegane's horse, and she's not autonomous here. And finally, they reach King's Landing when it's already under attack by Dragonfire, and the Hound manages to convince Arya to save herself and leave the capital before everything is getting destroyed. So in their interaction here, he goes back to the mentor role that he had in their first interaction and tells Arya that he's going to die anyway. She should save herself and she should not follow the path of revenge that he took so that she can become a better person than he was. There are 4 stages in their relationship, and even though it's always the same 2 characters that are being paired, Arya and Sandor Clegane, the dynamic in their relationship constantly transforms and remains interesting. Of course, the Hound and Arya are not the only 2 characters that are paired repeatedly. For example, there's Ser Davos Seaworth and Lady Melisandre, who often interact with each other while they're still advisors to Stannis Baratheon. but also later when they're at Castle Black and Lady Melisandre revives Jon Snow, and also afterwards when Sir Davos is an advisor to Jon Snow. Then there's Daenerys Targaryen and Ser Jorah Mormont. Ser Jorah was at her side from the very beginning of her story arc, basically, but the two of them go through a crisis in their relationship and are separated for a while, but still in the final season they are reunited. Then there are Sansa Stark and Littlefinger, who interact a lot of times, first in King's Landing, then at the Eyrie, and later in Winterfell. And as a final example, Tyrion Lannister and Varys, who develop a friendship while they're both at the Small Council in King's Landing, and then later join Daenerys Targaryen to serve as advisors to her. So all of these pairings are examples for lesson number 9. Repeatedly pair the same characters, especially after one of them or both of them have undergone some kind of development or transformation. Now for the final lesson, lesson 10, consider any action, no matter how insignificant it may seem, an opportunity for characterization. Game of Thrones certainly has a lot of big moments of characterization. We already had a look at one, Jaime Lannister pushing Bran out of the window, which is a major plot twist and a big moment to reveal something about this character. But leading up to these huge moments, you have dozens and sometimes hundreds of minor actions that your characters perform, and all of them can in some way be used to characterize and describe. Let's take a look at one of my favorite scenes from the entire show. So it's about a small council meeting, and we have different members of the small council arriving and taking their seat. And just pay attention to how they're doing that. That's a brilliant scene and a great lesson for characterization, because you learn so much about the different characters without them saying a single word. In this scene there are 5 main characters, and I'll just quickly walk you through that scene again and tell you how they are characterized. Let's start off with Tywin Lannister. So at this point in time, he's serving as Hand of the King, so he's leading all of the small council meetings. One of the first things we see is that he changed the location of the small council meetings to his own chambers. And he did that because going to another location for the small council meeting would be a waste of time, in his opinion. Also, the other thing that we can see is that he's the first one to arrive at the meeting, and all of the chairs are arranged orderly already, which he probably prepared. Then the other small council members arrive, Varys, Littlefinger, Tyrion, and Maester Pycelle, and they're all looking at Tywin for information for what they're supposed to do. He has all the authority, and everybody is aware that he is leading this interaction. So he looks back at them, waits a couple of seconds, and then sits down, and only then the other people start to move. So about Tywin we learn he's pragmatical. He doesn't want to waste time, so he just changes the location of the meeting. He's conscientious. He's the first one to arrive, and he arranged everything already. And he's the one commanding all the authority, and all the other council members are aware of this. Now, Varys, he's the first one who wants to move and thus get the seat closest to Tywin, the most powerful person in this scene. but then he sees that Littlefinger accelerates and passes him to get to that seat. So he stops and instead watches Littlefinger and then takes the second seat. So Varys, he's ambitious, he wants to move first, but he's also cautious, and when he sees that Littlefinger is about to do something, is about to accelerate, he rather stops and pays attention to what his rival Littlefinger is doing, cautious and attentive. Littlefinger, just like we saw before, he accelerates to get past Varys and takes the seat closest to Tywin, to the most powerful person. And during the whole scene, he only looks at Tywin. He doesn't pay attention too much to the other things that are going on. So he's ambitious, the first one to really move. He's confident enough to display his ambition by accelerating and getting past Varys. And for him, it's obviously important to sit close to the one in power. So he's power seeking, and Tywin is the person that he pays attention to, not necessarily what the other people are doing. Then there's Queen Cersei, and the first interesting thing is that she's late. So she arrives at the time that she chooses herself, not the one that was set. And she finds herself in a situation where basically she can only lose. The first 3 seats are already taken, so if she sits down on one of these chairs, she would be quite far away from her father and the powerful person in the room. So what she does is she simply grabs one of the chairs and moves it over to the other side of the table. And that was certainly something that was not intended by the way the chairs were arranged, but she still does it because for her it's a way to still sit close to the person leading this meeting. Cersei, she's also power seeking, just like Littlefinger, because she cares about sitting close to Tywin, but she is idiosyncratic, so she has her own mind and doesn't necessarily care too much about what others think, and that's clearly shown by this move of grabbing one of the chairs and moving it to the other side, and also by arriving late. And lastly, we have Tyrion. He's one of the first ones to arrive, but still the last one to move, so he's basically standing there all the time, watching what other people are doing. And then, just like his sister, he grabs one of the chairs, but unlike his sister, he moves it to the other end of the table, not to the side, and then sits down, basically creating a situation where he's facing his father, Tywin Lannister. In that way, he's both furthest away from the powerful person, but he's also sitting at the other end, so kind of making himself equal to Tywin with that move. So we learn about him. He's patient, he waits until everybody else has done their move. He's rebellious, he doesn't care about sitting close to Tywin, and he has a lot of confidence. So he also grabs one of the chairs and moves it, and he makes a lot of loud noises and even some extra noises at the end so that everybody can see what he's doing. If you consider this interaction some sort of political game where the goal is to get as close as possible to the powerful person, Tywin, then Tywin Lannister would be the one defining the game. So everything revolves around how people are seated in relationship to him, and he arranged all of the chairs before. Varys and Littlefinger, they're both playing the game that Tywin defined, even though in slightly different ways. Cersei appears and she still plays the same game. She wants to sit close to Tywin, but she changes the rules. So she grabs one of the chairs and moves it around, even though that wasn't intended. And very interestingly, Tyrion, he changes the entire game. So he also grabs a chair, but instead of moving it closer to Tywin, he puts it at the other end, and thus makes himself somewhat equal to Tywin. Alright, that's it about the last lesson. Let's just quickly go through what we've learned. So at the very beginning, we talked about personifying internal conflict. Think about Jaime Lannister and his relationship to both his sister, Queen Cersei, and Brienne of Tarth. Then we watched some scenes from the series and saw how you can give your dark characters some bright moments. That would include Cersei Lannister, who wants to be a good mother, and Ramsay Bolton, who wants to be recognized by his father, despite the evil things they do. Afterwards, we took a look at the guiding principles of a few characters. Tywin Lannister, who's concerned about the legacy of the Lannister family, Varys, who wants to bring about prosperity for the common people, and Daenerys, who wants to break the vicious circle of oppression. Sansa Stark showed us that you can develop your characters along a sequence of nuanced adjectives and drop graphs that just oscillate between good and evil over time. Her development was a journey from naive to capable of manipulation, with a lot of steps in between that can be described by very specific adjectives. Then Brandon Stark, Jaime Lannister, and Ned Stark were given as examples for taking away what your characters value most and making them suffer in very specific ways that are tailored to their personality. To make sure that a character's storyline is consistent with their personality, we should derive their victories from their virtues and failures from the flaw, just as it's done with Robb Stark in the series. We saw how characters acted in different power dynamics, specifically how Littlefinger treats his inferiors and how he treats superiors. We contrasted that with Tywin Lannister and his interactions with Arya Stark when she is working for him. Afterwards, we examined backstory and found out that it can be used to describe the present state of a character and not just to explain why and how they became the way they are. In the second to last lesson, we talked about character pairing, and Arya and the Hound served as an example to show that you can repeatedly pair the same characters but still have their relationship transform all the time to keep it interesting. And we saw that it's often the case that characters are paired again after one or both of them have developed in a certain way. And in the final lesson, we took a look at one of my favorite scenes and learned that any action, even just moving around a chair, can be a perfect opportunity for you to characterize the fictional people that you invented. That's it for this talk. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments section. Or if you have additional questions that you don't want to share with the public, or if you want to give me feedback on this presentation, you can send this to my email address, larskartov@web.de. And in case you ever want to go back to this presentation, maybe look at a condensed version, just take a look at the slides and the lessons. You can see a link here where you can download all of the slides as PDF. Thank you for your attention, and bye-bye.